Trump and Republicans are now rigging the 2026 midterms according to Gavin Newsom, and now Newsom's going nuclear. The Epstein-shaped hole that Donald Trump's been digging for himself just keeps getting deeper, with now victims and their families getting involved and calling BS. But Trump's freaking out and attacking allies over a Republican-led stock trading ban, and why this Ukraine scandal got Zelensky dragged down by his own people. We're talking about all that and even more on today's brand new Philip DeFranco show. You daily dive into the news, and actually, today you get a double dose. Because a brand new episode of my new podcast, In Good Faith with Philip DeFranco, it just went live on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and today's guest is Brian Tyler Cohen. It's a great listen. I got a link to it in the description. Go follow us there. But hey, we have a lot to talk about today, starting with this. The Epstein-shaped hole that Donald Trump's been digging for himself, it just keeps getting deeper and deeper. With him now not just getting heat from MAGA, from pundits or politicians, but also from Epstein's victims. With now a lot of it coming from the direction of Virginia Giuffre, the woman who alleged Ghislaine Maxwell recruited her from Mar-a-Lago back when she was a 16-year-old spa attendant there. And while obviously, she can't speak for herself since she tragically took her own life in April at the age of 41, her brothers, Sky and Danny, they said that they felt compelled to make a statement after what Trump's been saying this week. First, in regard to Epstein poaching Giuffre from Mar-a-Lago.
He stole her.
Second, in regard to whether he would pardon Maxwell.
I'm allowed to do it, but it's something I have not thought about.
And so in their statement, you had Giuffre's brothers and their wives making their position clear, saying the government and the president should never consider giving Ghislaine Maxwell any leniency. Ghislaine Maxwell is a monster who deserves to rot in prison for the rest of her life for the extraordinary violence and abuse she put not just our sister Virginia through, but many other survivors who may number in the thousands. And saying that she's a predator who thought only of herself, saying she destroyed the lives of girls and young women without conscience, saying Virginia always said that Ghislaine Maxwell was vicious and could often be more cruel than Epstein, and then finishing, she must remain in prison. Anything less would go down in history as being one of the highest travesties of justice. Right? But then also, they took aim straight at Donald Trump, saying it was shocking to hear President Trump invoke our sister and say that he was aware that Virginia had been stolen from Mar-a-Lago. It makes us ask if he was aware of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal actions, especially given his statement 2 years later that his good friend Jeffrey likes women on the younger side, no doubt about it. We in the public are asking for answers. Survivors deserve this. Right? And then, in response to that, you had White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt defending Trump, saying he did not bring Giuffre up, a reporter did. With her then adding, the fact remains that President Trump kicked Jeffrey Epstein out of his club for being a creep to his female employees. With then a senior administration official telling NBC News that no leniency is being given or discussed, and adding, the president himself has said that clemency for Maxwell is not something he is even thinking about at this time. But of course, that sort of response from Trump and his officials, it leaves open the possibility that he might later decide to pardon Maxwell. Right? And so you have many saying, why will he not just commit to leaving her in prison? Right? If someone asks you, hey, are you going to shoot that baby? You wouldn't say, well, I have this gun and I could. But it seems like any person that's not going to maybe shoot the baby would be like, that's a fucking insane question. Of course I'm not. It shouldn't be something you have to think about or say, well, I could. Meanwhile, there's also been growing scrutiny directed toward the fact that the person picked to question Maxwell last week was Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, a man who was literally Trump's personal defense lawyer before taking his current job, a man whose law firm reportedly received $9.2 million from the Save America PAC in 2023 and 2024 to defend Trump in the hush money trial and other cases, a man who, when asked during his confirmation hearing if he would have a continuing duty of loyalty and confidentiality to his former client even after becoming Deputy Attorney General, replied yes. Now he's also a man whose former colleague from when he was a federal prosecutor told the Washington Post that it's completely inappropriate and wrong for Blanche to be involved in the Maxwell case, saying that if a top Washington official had injected himself into a case Blanche handled as a prosecutor, he would have gone running to Main Justice, referring to the DOJ's DC headquarters. Right? And then adding, that just shows how completely far gone he is as an actual prosecutor. He's really more akin to a political player at this point. Now, also notably with this, when the Post asked the DOJ whether Blanche consulted a government ethics official before talking to Maxwell, they didn't respond directly, but you did have a spokesperson say, any suggestion that Todd Blanche has acted unethically while serving as Deputy Attorney General is baseless and defamatory. This gossip column relies on innuendo and the word of an agenda-driven political hack to push a false narrative. This is not a serious article. But Giuffre's family, they addressed this point in their statement as well, writing, if our sister could speak today, she would be most angered by the fact that the government is listening to a known perjurer, a woman who repeatedly lied under oath and will continue to do so as long as it benefits her position. Right? And then all of this is, we got to note, this is not the first time that victims or their families have spoken out against Trump recently. Right? You've had things like 4 of Epstein's victims giving NBC their reactions to that DOJ memo earlier this month, saying that there was no client list and nobody else would be prosecuted. You had Danielle Bensky, who said her heart sank at the news, adding, you never really heal, and with what's happening now, it feels like we're being erased. All the brave women who came forward, all the work that we did to tell the world what happened to us, it's all being erased. But then another woman who chose to remain anonymous for fear of retaliation, saying the memo terrified her and explaining, in the past, I was out there talking about what happened, and now I don't want my name out there in connection with anything to do with Epstein because I'm afraid of what they could do to me and my family. And saying, I am not surprised Trump is now saying we should stop talking about Epstein. These people are trying to protect themselves. And that is, you had Teresa Helm saying, when a person's abusers are repeatedly flashed in view at any given moment, and especially when promises of justice and promises of structures of power finally being held to account to then essentially have the door shut in your face and no longer open for business, then what? And then you had the fourth woman, Alicia Arden, saying she actually supports Trump, but still added. Pam Bondi was saying back in February there was a list, and then she said the list was on her desk, and now there is no list. She doesn't want something to come out, and I don't understand why. Maybe the list is more horrifying than we think. Right? Then also, this week, we saw the lawyer for several of Epstein's victims telling CBS.
Every single day, they have always said the information needs to get out. The president, as I have said before, could enter an executive order today, sign an executive order demanding the release of these documents. Sign that executive order today. I dare you to do so.
And that intervention, it's major because the excuse that congressional Republicans in the White House have given for not releasing the Epstein files is that they're actually protecting the victims' identifying information. But as this attorney speaking on behalf of those victims themselves put it, the argument is bogus.
We absolutely can go through and redact the names of the minor victims. That is a simple task that can be done on a base level, or on videotapes that they have. They can blur the victims' faces if they're minors.
Now, in lieu of those files, you have the White House instead asking the courts to release the transcripts from the grand juries that indicted Epstein and Maxwell, with one judge in Florida rejecting that request last week and the other in New York still considering it. But also, this week, we've learned that even if those transcripts come out, they only contain testimony from two people. And that, according to a court filing from the DOJ, which also added that those people aren't even victims. They're an FBI agent and an NYPD detective, which, it's not unusual for a grand jury, but it does cast doubt on the prospects that these transcripts would actually satisfy the public's desire for full transparency. And so with now yet another week of this seemingly nonstop Trump-Epstein scandal behind us, it just doesn't look like people are going to give up demanding the truth anytime soon, and people are looking to see what is Trump going to do. And then next up in the news, we've got to talk about Texas now unveiling a new gerrymandered map that is going to get Republicans 5 more seats most likely, in a move that is a blatant attempt to follow the demands of President Trump. Right? And this was not unexpected. We recently covered how Trump talked about needing Republicans to secure more seats. And, instead of trying to convince voters with good policies, he was like, just get a state like Texas to find up to 5 more seats by the midterms. And while the request was already inappropriate, what was extra unusual was that the new congressional maps, they weren't even supposed to be made for a few years. But regardless, Texas lawmakers were like, you got it, sir. And they proposed a version that would siphon a Democrat-heavy seat in the Austin, Dallas, and Houston metro areas alongside districts in southern Texas. And this is not a soft gerrymander with newly proposed districts will be kind of close. Instead, these are likely to give Republicans comfortable 10-point leads all over the place. To make matters worse is that Democrats likely have very little recourse in the state legislature to stop this, considering Republicans have 25 out of 38 seats. Instead, they're threatening to leave the state, denying a quorum and preventing sessions from being held. And of course, they've also been bashing the plan with accusations that the new districts are racist, which is actually very important because there are super clear laws and Supreme Court precedent that blocks districts from being dictated by race. And looking at the numbers, the new districts would largely make districts focused around race and heavily expand how many are white, Hispanic, and black majorities. Also, another massive criticism is that no Republican incumbent's going to have their district redrawn in a way that makes it competitive. And that is, you saw Texas representatives like Greg Kasar, for example, saying, if Trump is allowed to rip the Voting Rights Act to shreds here in Central Texas, his ploy will spread like wildfire across the country. Everyone who cares about our democracy must mobilize against this illegal map. And, he's not wrong. I talked about California Governor Gavin Newsom threatening a similar move if Texas went through with such extreme gerrymandering. And in fact, he even responded to this new map saying, Donald Trump asks for 5 seats and Greg Abbott automatically bends the knee. The 2026 election is being rigged. California won't sit back and watch this happen. Them then also saying it's loyalty over country every damn time for the GOP in reference to how much they seemingly bend over backwards for Trump. But for now, with what's happening in Texas around this, what's happening in California, and who knows where else, we're going to have to stay on top of this. Because very likely the actions and also inaction that we see play out in this whole field, it's going to affect the 2026 election. It's going to affect who controls the House and if it continues to act as a rubber stamp. And then I've got more news for you in just a minute. But first, summer is officially upon us and you need to get out more. And in fact, we've been giving out $500 every week for over a year now, thanks to our sponsor over at SeatGeek. And somehow, some of y'all still haven't entered, which is wild because the lineup right now is stacked. Lady Gaga, The Weeknd, Morgan Wallen, Lorde, Tate McRae, The Lumineers. There's something for everyone. And it's been really awesome seeing so many of you beautiful bastards winning the $500 SeatGeek weekly giveaway and using it to hit up concerts, games, Broadway shows, just living your best lives at live events. And if you haven't entered yet, it takes 2 seconds, and next week's $500 winner, it could be you. Because for the uninitiated, SeatGeek is the #1 rated ticketing app with over 28 million downloads and tickets to over 70,000 events, sports, music, comedy, theater, you name it. If you're a newbie, right, you're a first timer, download the app, scan the QR code, or hit the link in the description, and you use code Phil for $20 off your first ticket purchase. And then, and this is a key thing, you add code PDS to your SeatGeek account. That gets you $10 off of any ticket and enters you for your chance at the weekly $500 giveaway, and no purchases required. And so if you've used SeatGeek before, that applies to you too. Just add code PDS to your account and you're entered. So hey, scan that QR code or click the link below and use codes Phil and PDS and go make some memories. And then next up in the news, there's this viral video of just this shockingly vicious beatdown that has a lot of people saying a lot of different things depending on where you go on the internet. And I'd really love to hear from you. Right, so this started at around 3 a.m. Saturday in downtown Cincinnati, where you had dozens of people crowded into the street, where then in multiple videos, you see a group hitting and kicking a man to the ground and then continuing to pummel him as he lies there. And then at one point trying to stand up after the attack subsides, but then immediately falls down again. And then later on, we see a woman grabbing at another woman who is checking on the fallen man. But then another guy apparently punches the first woman, knocking her over and causing her head to slam onto the concrete. The video then ending as bystanders try to move the woman who is apparently unconscious with blood streaming from her mouth. And as far as why the hell any of this happened, at the time we had pretty much no idea. Where the videos going around had no context. You had police saying it started with a verbal altercation, but also you had people noting that if you stumbled onto it the same way that millions of other people did, you saw it from posts from right-wing influencers. And because of that, you would have gotten a very specific impression, right? And that in part because off the bat, you had the account End Wokeness posting the footage with the caption, "A white couple was brutally beaten at a jazz festival by a black teen mob in Cincinnati yesterday," which was then reposted by Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno, who accused Cincinnati's mayor of failing to keep the city safe. With that then reposted by Harmeet Dillon, the Assistant Attorney General for the DOJ Civil Rights Division, who commented, "Our federal hate crime laws apply to all Americans," saying nobody in our great nation should be the victim of such a crime, and where race is a motivation, federal law may apply. Then also ad libs of TikTok framing the video as white couple brutally beat by black mob and suggesting you probably won't see it in the mainstream media. But then Elon Musk sharing it to his over 200 million followers, commenting, "That guy almost killed this woman, aggravated assault." And then when End Wokeness accused mainstream media outlets of ignoring the story, you had the AI formerly known as Mecha Hitler opining about why in the replies, saying the Cincinnati assault highlights a grim reality. FBI data, 2019 UCR, shows black Americans, 13% of the population, account for 52% of murder arrests. Media blackout on this story, telling, "We need real solutions, not silence." With Musk sharing the End Wokeness post and adding, "Why zero stories?" To which Grok once again gave its opinion, saying, "Mainstream media often ignores stories like this brutal mob assault on a white couple as it doesn't fit narratives prioritizing certain racial dynamics." And then finally, you had Vice President J.D. Vance, whose half brother is actually running for Cincinnati mayor, commenting, though he didn't explicitly take the racial angle.
And I haven't seen the full context, but what I saw is a mob of lawless thugs beating up on an innocent person, and it's disgusting. And I hope every single one of those people who engage in violence is prosecuted to the full extent of the law. We've had way too much lawlessness on the streets of great American cities.
But then on Monday, what you had was the Cincinnati police chief shooting back at the way that this incident was instantly politicized.
Social media, the post that we've seen, does not depict the entire incident. Because what happens, that social media post and your coverage of it distorts the content of what actually happened. And it makes our job more difficult.
They're then also sharing,
"It is clear to us that alcohol played a part, a significant part, in this incident."
And she then defended the law enforcement response, saying that the officers were stuck in dense traffic, but still got there 6 minutes after the first 911 call.
That response time is completely acceptable.
Right, and then with all this, you had the police reportedly charging 5 people that were involved in the fight, and 3 of them appeared in court yesterday. The police alleging that the trio coordinated the brawl and deliberately ambushed the victims, saying that in one video, one of them whispered into the ear of another just before they started the attack, but you had attorneys for at least 2 of the suspects claiming it was actually self-defense, right, claiming that they were actually struck first after the supposed victim kicked their car.
He confronts the guy and said, "What are you doing?" That's when, and this clip does exist on social media, it doesn't paint the whole picture, this white individual reaches over, says, "That's your car," and slaps my client in the face.
You then also had the mother of the defendant facing the most serious charges, telling WLWT this about her son.
"I want to put it out there, and he's not a racist. He have a biracial child."
But then others, they took a different angle in their defense of the suspects. Cincinnati Councilwoman Victoria Parks provoking a storm of outrage when she replied to the fight video on Facebook saying, "They begged for that beatdown. I am grateful for the whole story." Then several of her fellow council members condemning her comments, saying that elected officials should never condone violence. And you then had a GOP state representative, Phil Plummer, saying that Parks must resign immediately, and adding, "Defending violent criminals who viciously beat innocent people is disgusting." But then also when WLWT reached out to Parks, not only did she confirm the post was hers, she stood by it. Right? And then as all of that is playing out, you have other people debating and talking about how did we get here? Arguing that what happened here is a very serious but isolated incident, and it shouldn't have become a political football in the national culture war. For example, an op-ed in the Columbus Dispatch writing, "Our Republican leaders and possible future governor's collective outrage against it is smart but divisive politics that builds on a long tradition of freaking white people out about the scary black uprising overtaking larger American cities." With it then pointing out that nobody lost their life in this brawl, whereas gun violence claims hundreds every year, including a mass shooting at a Columbus house party this month. And you had that piece asking, why push for policies that improve the lives of Ohioans when you can race bait and shake your finger at political opponents at the same time, with it then finishing up by arguing that this is not strictly a Democrat or Republican issue. Right? Instead, saying crime is an issue that Ohio's Democratic mayors have to address, but so do its Republican governor and J.D. Vance himself, who represented the state in Congress and now serves in the White House. And actually, in fact, with that, yesterday you had the governor and Cincinnati's mayor announcing that the State Highway Patrol would work with city police on traffic enforcement, freeing them up to address other crimes. Right? And so all in all, that is where the story is right now. There's a lot of moving parts. We're gonna have to see what happens, but in the meantime, I'd really love to know your thoughts, reactions, and opinions. And then next up in the news, we gotta talk about how this bill to ban the president president, vice president, and members of Congress from trading stocks, it just cleared a key hurdle in the Senate. But, fun thing, the version that passed, a key part of it would not apply to Donald Trump. Now with that, I'll say this wasn't a full vote, it was just the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. But notably, every Democrat on the committee supported the legislation, and every Republican, they opposed it, except for Josh Hawley. Right, and this is a big thing. Josh actually sponsored the bill, but he also made the change to make sure that it would not apply to Donald Trump. Right, because his original proposal would have required Trump advance to sell off investments starting in 2027 when they'd still be in office. But with the version that actually got approved, that requirement doesn't kick in until the start of an elected official's next term, meaning that it would never apply to them. You actually had Rand Paul, who's the chair of the committee, making that the main point of his argument against the bill, saying the substitute protects Donald Trump. The original bill does not protect Donald Trump. I hope everyone will think about that. I would oppose the substitute change because I think it should apply to everybody or nobody. Although very notably there, another Republican, Rick Scott, he actually tried to get Trump fully exempted from the stock trading ban. And he also tried to add language requiring a report on trades by former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her family. And that, as Ron Johnson argued, that the bill would make it very unattractive for people to step up to the plate and run for office. But then also claiming that since insider trading is already illegal, the proposal was a completely unnecessary piece of legislation. Though that, as most Americans, they do not share that belief. More than 80% of voters support banning members of Congress from trading individual stocks, according to public polling. So you had Democrats arguing that the issue was so important that they were willing to vote for a version that partially exempts Trump. Or with Alyssa Slotkin, for example, saying, the American people think that all of us, Democrats and Republicans, are using our positions and our access to enrich ourselves. People don't believe that we are here for the right reasons. You gotta start somewhere. I'll take what I can get. Right? And all of this is, this is an area where there actually could be an opportunity for bipartisanship. Understand that both Democrats and Republicans have made money trading stocks. And because of that, it's helped fuel a push for new rules against it from both sides of the aisle. For example, the likes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez supporting it, but also people like far-right Republican Chip Roy. And then, as far as Donald Trump, in the past, he suggested that he'd sign a bill if it ended up on his desk. But then, with this committee vote, you just had him attacking Hawley, writing on social media. I don't think real Republicans want to see their president, who has had unprecedented success, targeted because of the whims of a second-tier senator named Josh Hawley. So ultimately, you have this situation where you have Donald Trump and his Republican-controlled Congress that he's essentially told to stand back and stand by. So there's this question based off of how he's acting now, even though there's seemingly bipartisan support for this, does it even come up for a full vote before the Senate? And then I've got even more news for you in just a minute. But first, roaming charges are just your carrier's passive-aggressive way of saying, we hope you get lost in a foreign country. And I mean, it's 2025. How are roaming charges still even a thing, honestly? We all should have a proper eSIM to combat this particular evil. And that is why I use Saley, the eSIM app that actually lets you travel without getting mugged by your mobile plan. When download it, gives you instant access to affordable data in 200 plus countries, no SIM swaps, no Wi-Fi only desperation. Plus, their built-in ad blocker, it helps you use up to 28% less data. Honestly, clutch. Plans, they're affordable, coverage is global, and setup takes less time than it does to get through customs. Just download the app, right? Use the link, scan the QR code, choose the country, the plan, and for you guys, enter code PHIL to get 15% off. Or you can message your partner, book your ride, find your hotel, all while other tourists are still figuring out where to buy a SIM. And also, full refunds if your phone's not eSIM compatible. With this, yes, I've used it myself and it has saved my ass more than once. So hey, scan that QR code on your screen or click the link in the description, and don't forget to use code PHIL at checkout to save 15%. Travel smart, travel safely. And then next up in the news, you have Donald Trump right now continuing to take a wrecking ball to global trade. And you also have the court system still trying to figure out if he even has the power to actually do it. And all of that as we're now just one day away from Trump's latest tariff deadline. And as the White House has been scrambling to make some last minute deals, you've also got this panel of judges that's been hearing arguments that many of his tariffs, including those imposed as part of these last minute deals, are actually illegal. And I'll explain because there's just been so much going on. Back in April, you had Trump rolling out a sweeping 10% tariff on nearly all US trading partners, with him then also announcing what he called reciprocal tariffs on certain nations that went as high as 50%. He then put a 90-day pause on most of the tariff hikes, just keeping the 10% baseline rate in place. And you had Trump claiming that the US would use that time to get better trade deals. And his administration even said at one point that he would make 90 deals in 90 days. But those 90 days, they came and went, and when you know it, 2 deals were made. One with the UK keeping tariffs at 10%, and one with Vietnam setting the rate at 20%. And so then you had Trump basically pushing back the deadline to August 1st, which is tomorrow as I'm recording this. And in that time, he's actually at least announced a few more deals. With Indonesia, the Philippines, and Japan last week, with the 27-member European Union earlier this week, and with South Korea yesterday. Though notably, he hasn't reached a deal with Mexico, which is the US's largest trading partner, though he also then announced today another 90-day extension for talks. He also hasn't made a deal with Canada, which is our second largest trading partner, though he also didn't hint at an extension either, with him instead saying that it would be very hard to make a deal now that the country said it might recognize a Palestinian state. But in any case, a key thing with all this is that no one has been talking their way out of tariffs entirely. Right, in the case of the EU, for example, the tariff rate will be 15%, which is a lot less than the 30% that Trump threatened previously, but is still pretty high. And then beyond that, the bloc has reportedly agreed to buy $750 billion of energy products from the US and invest an additional $600 billion in the country. And we're seeing something similar with the latest deal with South Korea, for example, which is also getting hit with 15% tariffs, down from 25%, which was previously threatened. And there you had Trump claiming that the country will give the United States $350 billion for investments owned and controlled by the United States, and saying that these investments will be selected by him, as well as claiming that South Korea will purchase $100 billion of LNG or other energy products from the US. But then beyond that, as you may have guessed, or at least you should expect, details about how exactly this would all work they're sparse. Though we're actually getting some more information from the South Korean side, with the president there saying that of the $350 billion that his country has promised to invest in the US, $150 will go into helping build ships, including warships, which even on its own is notable because South Korea actually builds more vessels than any other country in the world except for China. And that as US shipbuilding and the country's navy is said to be in decline. Now, of course, on the other side of all that, there's a concern about the potential for this to raise prices in the United States. I mean, just talking about South Korea, it's actually the 7th biggest importer of goods to the United States, shipping $132 billion worth of goods to the United States just last year, according to the Department of Commerce. And in addition to cars and car parts, semiconductors and electronics were among the top goods that Americans bought from there. And notably, according to Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, none of these goods are exempt, with him just saying that South Korea, quote, wouldn't be treated any worse than any other country on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, and also adding, steel, aluminum, and copper are not included in the New Deal and remain unchanged. Right, with that, he's talking about the separate 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum that have been in effect since June, as well as the 50% tariffs on copper imports that Trump's putting in place with an executive order that was signed on Wednesday. And actually, along with that, he signs an order that ended the so-called de minimis exemption, which allowed goods worth less than $800 to enter the country duty-free and without the need for detailed customs paperwork. With Trump having ended the exemption for imports from China back in May, but now, starting on August 29th, it'll be for goods coming from anywhere. With that seeming to be Trump trying to make sure that there's absolutely no way of getting around the new tariffs. And actually, on that note, there's more that we haven't even talked about yet. Right, this week, you had Trump announcing a 25% tariff on goods from India, with him also claiming there'd be an additional import tax because of India's purchasing of Russian oil. You also had him stepping it up against Brazil. As you may remember, he threatened 50% tariffs on Brazil earlier this month while accusing the country of orchestrating a witch hunt against Jair Bolsonaro, who, if you forgot, is the former president who's accused of plotting to poison his successor, shoot dead the Supreme Court justice investigating him, and reinstall himself as the country's leader. And so now you have Trump officially signing an executive order to implement the tariff increase, with the U.S. also announcing sanctions against the Supreme Court justice that I mentioned before. Though also in that executive order, Trump cites something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which Trump claiming that there is a national emergency in the United States because of Brazil's handling of U.S. tech and social media companies, as well as its prosecution of Bolsonaro. In this law, it's the same law that Trump's invoked to impose many of his tariffs, declaring a national emergency over the large and persistent U.S. trade deficit. And that is before Trump took office, no president had ever invoked the law to impose tariffs on other nations, because generally it's Congress, not the president, that has the power to impose tariffs except in limited cases. And so in May, you had a federal trade court actually ruling that Trump doesn't have unbounded powers to impose duties as he saw fit. But then Trump's Justice Department quickly appealed and got a temporary halt to the mandate, allowing the president's tariffs to remain in place. But now a federal appeals court has taken up the case, hearing oral arguments today, and whatever they decide, it could potentially strike down the tariffs, including those that are part of these trade deals. Though also, notably, many tariffs would still remain in place, and there's a possibility that some could be reinstated using other mechanisms. And so for now, Trump's tariff tango continues to go on and on and on. And then, next up in the news today, we gotta talk about this craziness out of Ukraine. Because in what some are calling just a huge unforced error, Ukrainian President Zelensky had to bow down to public pressure and reverse changes to anti-corruption laws after days of mass protests. And so just cutting straight to the controversial part, last week you had lawmakers sneaking in a bunch of amendments into anti-corruption laws and placing the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office under the supervision of the National Attorney General. And that man is an ally of Zelensky, though it would have been controversial regardless of who is in charge. Those agencies, they're supposed to be outside of the normal government in order to watch over them. By placing them under the control of an office that the president indirectly controls, it opens the door for corruption if the politically appointed attorney general can just kill cases. Now with this, you had Zelensky try to claim that the two agencies were filled with Russian influence and that the change was needed to get rid of it, but to say that people were skeptical of that claim, that's an understatement. Especially because the agencies were starting to look into Zelensky allies and slap them with charges, and so the timing had felt way too close. And so over the past week, Ukraine has seen the largest protest since the war with Russia began, with many feeling that the changes were a betrayal of the democratic pushes that Zelensky has tried to make since taking office. Although in many ways, Zelensky is almost paradoxical when it comes to this. Right, on the one hand, he's tried to push serious democratic reforms, but then on the other, he claims that the pressure of the war with Russia, it means that martial law has to stay in place. And that's something that concentrates a lot of power in his office. Even outside of Ukraine, there was widespread criticism, and in particular, you had the European Union just really not happy to hear about the change, with a warning that the law could jeopardize Ukraine's plan to join the Union, which tries to curb corruption and requires robust laws to prevent it. Though I'm sure, there's no shortage of EU citizens that would tell us otherwise, though also who's ever actually happy with their government? I don't know anymore, but the bloc, they even cut aid to Ukraine over. And that's without mentioning that Ukraine actually has a long history of corruption, even above the norm for former Soviet states. But over there, it's been argued that small things like bribes at the DMV, they're hardly viewed as corruption and more just kind of a way to grease the cogs of government. But even with that being kind of the perceived norm, the public's perception of corruption there, it's high, and it was a prime factor in the 2014 protests that ousted Russian puppets in the government, all of which then led to the war with Russia for the past 11 years. But either way, Zelensky and his party were then also quick to reverse course, and in just a matter of a few days, you had dozens of lawmakers who had voted for the changes doing a complete 180, and Zelensky quickly signing it into law. The news of which led to celebrations in Kyiv, with then the president of the European Commission praising the move, saying, restoring the anti-corruption agency's independence is a welcome step. Ukraine's rule of law and anti-corruption reform should continue. They remain essential for Ukraine's progress on the European path. And that, as you had other key EU officials, like the person in charge of making the bloc bigger, warning that today's law restores key safeguards, but challenges remain. Right, and then with all this, if we take a step back, it's important to note, this is one of the few internal crises that Zelensky's faced since taking office. However, it could also just be a massive unforced error with both internal internal opponents as well as allies. His supporters now feel at least some level of trust has been broken, while critics claim that he's just as corrupt as any other Ukrainian politician, and this is proof. So for now, we'll have to see if this was just a bump in the road or it's a crack that leads to something bigger. But that, my friend, you beautiful bastard, is where today's show is going to end. But remember, show doesn't have to be over. I just posted this week's episode of In Good Faith with Philip DeFranco, my brand new interview podcast over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and today's guest was Brian Tyler Cohen. I've got links in the description there. Definitely follow us, give us 5 stars there, help the show grow. And then also, remember, we got a new schedule on this channel. You're getting a Friday video and a Sunday video. And those go live for you earlier at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. So hey, thank you for watching. Stay safe out there, stay sane out there, and I'll see you tomorrow.